A con artist can pick their next target out of a crowd of strangers in about 7 seconds. Not by guessing, by reading you, the same way a doctor reads an x-ray. And the unsettling part is that the traits they're looking for have almost nothing to do with intelligence or gullibility. They're looking for something far more ordinary, something almost everyone does without noticing. It has nothing to do with how much money is in your account or how many degrees are on your wall. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You probably already passed the test and failed it without ever meeting the person who was scoring you. Confidence tricksters aren't playing a numbers game, throwing a wide net and hoping someone bites. Research suggests they're running a specific, learnable filter on everyone they meet, and most of us give off exactly the signals they're searching for, without saying a single word, or ever realizing we were being read at all. By the time you notice anything, the reading is already finished. And unlike a fingerprint or a face, this particular signal is almost impossible to consciously hide, because most people have never been told it exists at all. In 1981, researchers Betty Grayson and Maura Stein ran a study that still shapes how criminologists understand targeting. They showed convicted violent offenders silent video clips of ordinary pedestrians walking down a New York street and asked them to rate how easy each person would be to attack. The offenders agreed with each other remarkably closely, far more closely than random guessing could explain, even though none of them had discussed their reasoning with each other beforehand. And when researchers studied what they were actually responding to, it wasn't age, size, or clothing. It was gait, the length of someone's stride, how their weight shifted, whether their movements looked fluid and self-directed or hesitant and disjointed. The signal, in other words, wasn't visible for more than a few seconds of ordinary walking, and the people being watched never knew a rating was happening at all. Con artists appear to run a similar, unconscious filter, just tuned to a different signal entirely. Instead of hesitant walk, they're scanning for a hesitant no. Psychologists who study fraud victimization describe it as reading someone's baseline compliance. How quickly a person agrees, apologizes, or fills an awkward silence within the first few moments of contact. It's not about being unintelligent. Some of the most convincing marks in recorded fraud cases have been surgeons, professors, and financial executives, people whose entire careers depended on sharp judgment in every other context of their lives. That single detail should bother you more than almost anything else in this video, because it means the skill that makes you polite, agreeable, and easy to get along with is the exact same skill a trained predator is measuring you by in the first few seconds of conversation that feels completely ordinary. But compliance alone isn't the whole filter. The second thing con artists probe for is timing. Researchers who study fraud victims have repeatedly found that certain life transitions, a recent divorce, a death in the family, a retirement, a move to a new city, sharply increase susceptibility. Not because grief makes someone less intelligent, but because transitions create a temporary hunger for connection, and connection is precisely the currency a confidence trickster deals in. Some victimization researchers describe this as a widened window of trust, a period where new relationships form faster than usual, simply because the old support structure has just changed shape. There's a name for what happens when a con artist finds both signals at once high compliance and a recent loss. Investigators call it a soft target, and once someone qualifies, the approach rarely looks like a sales pitch at all. It looks like friendship, patient, generous, and in no apparent hurry. Here's where it gets darker. Because the most successful fraud in history wasn't built on strangers. It was built on trust that already existed. Financial regulators have a specific term for this: affinity fraud. Fraud that spreads inside a group whose members already trust each other, a church, a retirement community, an immigrant community, a tight professional circle. Regulators note that affinity fraud is especially difficult to detect early because victims actively defend the scheme to outsiders, on behalf of someone their whole community already vouches for, sometimes for years after the first warning signs appear. The largest Ponzi scheme ever uncovered, run by Bernie Madoff, relied almost entirely on this exact structure. Early investors were friends, synagogue members, and country club acquaintances who vouched for him to the next circle and the next until the referral chain stretched across an entire community, and eventually across entire institutions that managed other people's retirement funds. Nobody needed convincing from a stranger. They only needed a nod from someone they already trusted. That's a mechanism researchers keep returning to. A con artist rarely needs to build trust from nothing. It's far more efficient to simply borrow trust that somebody else already built, one relationship at a time, until the borrowing itself becomes invisible. Consider a pattern documented across dozens of fraud case files. Call him Daniel, a composite drawn from investigator interviews and court testimony. Daniel didn't cold call strangers. He joined a golf club, slowly, over 18 months, becoming a familiar, generous face. He remembered names, picked up bar tabs, celebrated other members' milestones, and never once mentioned investing, until members started asking him first, usually after watching him quietly succeed at something else entirely. He let curiosity build on its own, rather than pushing, because pushing is what strangers do, and Daniel had stopped being a stranger months earlier. By the time Daniel offered anyone a deal, he was a stranger asking for money. He was a friend, sharing an opportunity. Several members later admitted, under investigation, that they skipped their usual due diligence, specifically because the recommendation came from inside the group they trusted most. The fraud wasn't hidden behind lies. It was hidden behind exactly the kind of social proof that normally keeps people safe. By the time the scheme collapsed, several members said they had recommended Daniel to family members of their own, without a second thought. And here's the part investigators find hardest to explain to victims afterward. Being conned was never a measure of how smart they were. Psychologists studying persuasion note that fraud resistance correlates poorly with general intelligence, and much more closely with a specific kind of skepticism, one that has to be deliberately practiced because it runs against basic social instinct. One widely cited review of victimization research found that education level and cognitive ability showed almost no protective effect once trust and social pressure were involved, and in some samples, financial sophistication was actually associated with slightly higher losses, likely because confident investors question less. Trusting people who vouch for each other is usually the correct strategy for navigating life. Con artists don't exploit stupidity. They exploit the exact same wiring that lets healthy communities function at all. Some research also points to a quieter factor, optimism bias, the deeply human tendency to believe bad things happen to other people, statistically less likely to happen to us specifically. It's part of why warnings rarely work in advance, and part of why victims so often say the same thing afterward, that they knew these schemes existed. They just never imagined recognizing one from the inside, while it was wearing a familiar face. Nobody believes a 7-second read is happening to them in the moment it's happening. So what actually helps? Start by treating urgency itself as information. Real opportunities can survive a week of research and a second opinion. Patient capital rarely needs to close by Friday, and legitimate people rarely resent being asked to wait. Manufactured ones almost never can survive that same delay. If someone visibly discourages you from checking with a lawyer, an accountant, or even just a skeptical friend, that reaction alone is worth more than anything they say next. Second, separate the messenger from the offer. A recommendation from someone you trust tells you they trust the person recommending it, not that the investment or opportunity was independently verified by anyone at all. Ask what specifically they personally checked, not just how confident they feel about it, and notice if the question itself makes anyone uncomfortable. In most affinity fraud cases on record, that one simple question was never asked at all by anyone in the entire chain. Third, protect people you know during major life transitions, deliberately and on purpose. Grief, divorce, and retirement aren't just emotionally difficult. Research suggests they're measurably higher risk windows, precisely when familiar, generous new friend can appear most welcome. A single check-in call, during exactly those months, closes a door that a trained predator is specifically watching for. None of this means you should become guarded with everyone, all the time. That would just trade one problem for another, and most relationships genuinely are what they appear to be. Most people asking for your trust deserve it completely, but the 7 seconds it takes to be read are also the 7 seconds where a pause, a question, or a moment of friction quietly signals that you're not an easy target after all. Now you know what that quick, silent read is actually measuring. Not your intelligence and not your worth, just your willingness to make things easy for someone else. Subscribe, because the next video goes even deeper.